The snow had a silence to it that winter, the kind that settled over the bones of things and stayed there like a judgment. Wind whispered through the pine posts of the porch, tugging at loose bark and forgotten nails as if the house itself were being asked if it still wished to remain standing. He didn't speak anymore, not out loud, not to the wind, nor the cattle, nor the Lord, not even to the headstone planted beneath the cottonwood, where the frost never seemed to melt. That stone carried two names, now his wife's, and the daughter who came too early and left too small. Some said broke something in him, others said there wasn't much left in him to begin with. The neighbors stopped visiting after the first snowfall, not out of cruelty, just the way folks retreat from grief like it might be catching. So the widower worked. He moved like a man bound to the earth, hauling firewood, with knotted hands fixing fence rails that had no business standing, oiling saddle leather he hadn't touched in months. He slept little, ate less. Some days it seemed he was only kept alive by the weight of his own mourning. And then one morning she arrived. She came on a mule cart that didn't belong to her, driven by a stable boy who refused to make eye contact. Her boots crunched the snow like she'd walked that road before, even though she hadn't set foot on that land in years. Her coat was thin, her lips were chapped, and her eyes. Well, her eyes were the kind of tired only women get, the kind that comes from tending other people's sorrows long after they stop tending their own. She didn't knock. He heard the door open, heard the thud of her bag on the floorboards, and heard the words she spoke like someone reciting a verse memorized not from hope, but survival. "I'll stay in the loft, won't be in the way." That was all. He didn't answer, not with words. He walked out the front door and stayed gone until after dusk, letting the cold burn at his skin like a penance. When he came back, a fire had been lit, the floor had been swept, and the stew pot smelled faintly of onion and rosemary. He ate in silence. She ate across from him, saying nothing. Only the spoon tapping the rim of the bowl marked the time passing between them. Her name he already knew. Of course he did. She was his sister-in-law, a woman who used to write long letters with ink-stained fingers and wild romantic notions before time and disappointment had pressed her into something quieter. He hadn't seen her since the funeral, when she stood in the back pew and wept without sound. That first week passed like smoke. She kept to herself, rising early to stoke the fire, feeding the hens, sewing seams by oil lamp glow. He never asked her to. She never offered explanation, and that seemed to suit them both. But something strange began to happen. The house, for so long sunk in stillness, started to breathe again, slowly, unevenly, like a body waking from fever. The dishes got washed, the curtains got open. A slice of pie appeared one night, unspoken, beside his bowl of beans. He didn't touch it. Not that night, but the next morning it was gone. Still, he did not speak, and she didn't press. There was something waiting between them. Not romance, not yet. Something heavier, a shadow that hadn't decided whether to fall or lift. On the seventh evening, just as the sky turned the color of dying embers, she came in from chopping wood, snowflakes clinging to her collar. She paused in the doorway. "You ever going to ask why I came?" she said, soft. Like the question had been weighing down her coat. He didn't look up from the chair. "No." She let out a breath that could have been laughter or could have been sorrow. "Good." Then she crossed the room, placed a small candle on the windowsill and lit it. "For them," she said, "so they know we remember." He didn't answer, just stared into the hearth where a log cracked like a bone being split. That night sleep came heavy, but not deep. Around midnight he stirred. He wasn't sure what woke him. The wind maybe, or the sound of the candle still burning on the windowsill, casting tall shadows across the floor, like old ghosts stretching their legs. Or maybe it was something else. A sound not of this house, soft, unsteady like breathing. He rose. The hallway was dark. Her door was ajar, and what he saw stopped him like a bullet to the ribs. She was curled at the edge of the bed, shoulders trembling, her hand clutching something close to her chest. The moonlight caught it, a letter wrinkled and worn. Her sister's writing, maybe, or something worse. He turned away, back to his room, laid there, eyes open, listening to her grief echo down the hall, like a song no one should have to sing alone. Morning brought no mention of it, but when she came to clear the table, he reached out, not to touch her hand, not yet, but to place something on the wood between them. It was his wife's bonnet, folded, pressed still, holding the scent of lavender soap. "I couldn't burn it," he said. First words in days. Her breath caught. She didn't take the bonnet. Not then. Just nodded once and walked away. Spring would be months coming still, but something in the air had shifted. Not warm, not yet, but less cruel. 2 nights later, she sat on the porch after supper, eyes fixed on the cottonwood grave. He joined her without a word, bringing 2 tin cups and a bottle of his last good whiskey. They drank in silence. Then she spoke. "She loved you fiercely. I used to envy it." He nodded slow. "I never knew how to give her peace," he said. "You tried," she whispered, and she knew. The wind stirred. He turned to her eyes, glassy but dry. "You staying long?" She didn't answer right away, just looked toward the fields white and wide. "As long as it takes." That night he brought in the firewood before she asked. A day later, he fixed the porch rail she always leaned on, and a week after that he brought home a fresh pair of gloves, thick-lined and just her size. He didn't give them to her, just left them on the table, the same way she left the pie. A language was forming, one made not of letters or grand confessions, but of gestures, glances. The quiet tether of kindness strung one thread at a time. But even kindness cannot live long without conflict. And the wind always. The wind carried more than snow that winter. It carried word whispers from the church, from the general store, from the mail carrier who didn't mean to eavesdrop but heard anyway. The townsfolk had begun to talk. 2 souls, 1 roof, no ring, and the history soaked in shared sorrow. She heard it first. A woman with a crooked smile at the quilting circle. "Widower's got himself a new housewife already." She said nothing, but the stitch she made that moment went crooked, and her hands trembled for the rest of the day. He heard it next. At the trading post, 2 men near the barrels, one spat tobacco and said men don't mourn that quick unless he was already looking. The widower didn't flinch, but that night he didn't join her on the porch. She noticed, said nothing, but left the candle burning longer than usual. That silence stretched between them, long and brittle, until one night she found the bonnet gone from its place, replaced by a fresh piece of parchment, a note, just 5 words. "She'd want you to stay." The first time in weeks her knees gave way beneath her. She sat on the steps of the porch, sobbing into her gloves. Not because of grief, but because someone had finally told her she could belong. Inside, the fire crackled. Outside, the snow began to melt, not with warmth, but with time. And above them, both somewhere between candlelight and memory, the past began to loosen its hold. Just a little, but enough. There were days when the house seemed to hold its breath. A knot of silence lived in the beams, like laughter had once echoed there, but vanished so thoroughly that even the walls forgot what joy sounded like. The floors creaked out of habit. The clock ticked because it had no other job. And though 2 people moved through that space, eating, sweeping, mending, feeding, they didn't fill it. Not yet. The widower still spoke little. His grief didn't shout anymore, but it hadn't softened either. It lived in the tightness of his jaw, the way his boots paused at the edge of his wife's old garden, as if something invisible still grew there. He never crossed that line, not even to pull weeds. She, the sister-in-law, moved with more certainty now. Her steps no longer hesitated in the hallway. She claimed the old spare room and polished the windows until light had no choice but to come in. Her hands were always busy sewing, stacking firewood, cleaning shelves that hadn't seen care in years. But behind every motion there was something restrained. She never sang, never whistled, never hummed. One afternoon, a child passed by the house, a rancher's boy sent to deliver dried goods. He looked around wide-eyed, then asked the question with the honest cruelty only children possess. "Mister, is she your new wife?" The widower had paused, sack of oats in hand. The boy, oblivious, kept on. "Ma says it ain't right. Says decent women don't live with men alone unless there's vows." The sack hit the floor harder than it should have. He didn't answer. The boy just closed the door. But the silence after felt different, heavier, like the walls themselves had overheard. Later that evening, she found the bonnet again, folded neatly tucked atop a stack of linens in the chest by the fire. He'd put away. That night, the candle on the windowsill stayed unlit. He ate dinner alone. The next morning, a neighbor dropped by, a woman with sharp cheekbones and sharp opinions. She brought a pie unasked, called a charity, left it on the stoop with a note scrawled too quickly. "Some things are better whispered to God, not lived out loud." She read it twice, didn't cry, just burned it in the stove before he came in from the barn. But the pie stayed on the counter untouched. The house, once beginning to breathe, shrank again. For 3 days they barely crossed paths. He chopped wood before dawn and returned after dusk. She stayed to herself, reading by the fire with her shawl drawn tight as if the cold had crept in again. But the worst came when she went into town. It wasn't meant to be dramatic, just a simple errand. Flour, salt, a new needle. She rode the mule cart slow, wrapped in a cloak, in silence. The general store was near empty, just the owner and two women from church. She nodded at them, politely said good morning. They stared back like she'd spoken in tongues. "Didn't know you was back," one of them said, "or that you'd stayed on." She smiled. That fragile kind helping with the ranch. The other woman laughed, once brittle. "Sure, that what folks are calling it now." Heat rose to her face, but she said nothing. She paid, thanked the shopkeep, and turned to leave. And as she stepped outside, she heard one of them hiss behind her, sleeping in her sister's bed. My lord, the wind howled harder than usual that night. The sky held no stars. She didn't tell him what they said. Not directly. But that evening, when he set down a fresh loaf on the table between them, she looked up and asked a question she hadn't dared until then. "Do you believe they're right?" He didn't move. Not at first. Then he sat down across from her, the fire crackling low behind him. "They don't know grief," he said finally. "They only know stories." She nodded. "And us?" He didn't answer. She didn't press. But something slipped between them that night. Not anger, not affection. Just a mutual ache, two people haunted, not by what they'd done, but by what others imagined they had. The next morning the mule cart was gone. She'd taken out early before sunrise, leaving only a folded note on the kitchen table. "Just need air. Won't be long." He waited until dusk. When she hadn't returned, he saddled the mare. The trail was still marked with wheel ruts, shallow and trembling along the frozen road. He followed it past the ridge through the cottonwood pass all the way to the far bluff, where wild sage grew thick and restless. There she was standing alone at the edge, shawl flapping in the wind. She didn't turn when he approached. "Just said I used to come here as a girl, pretend I could fly." He didn't dismount. "You ran," he said. "No," she whispered. I remembered. The silence swelled between them like a third presence. Then she turned to face him, eyes raw. "They look at me and see something shameful. A woman staying too long in a house too filled with memory. But I'm not here for them." His hands gripped the reins tighter. Then why her voice trembled, but not with weakness. "I came to bury my sister. I stayed because I'm not the only one who lost her." For a moment neither of them moved. Then he dismounted slowly, boots crunching frost as he stepped forward. He offered her the scarf from his neck. She didn't take it, but when he turned back toward the horse, she followed. They rode home in silence, and when they reached the porch, he spoke softly. "Let him talk. They don't know the shape of our grief." That night the candle returned to the windowsill. The next week brought changes, small, deliberate ones. He asked her to help mend the shed roof. She brought fresh herbs to the stew. He started warming her tea kettle before she woke. She began singing again, barely audible, but it was there. One late afternoon, a young couple arrived from the next ranch over newlyweds. They came for advice on building a chicken coop. She stepped in to help, organize, kind, confident. The bride whispered as they left, "Your home, it feels like a good place." She smiled, not wide, but genuine. Later that night, he brought her a book. It had belonged to his wife once, but the inscription had faded. "Thought maybe you'd like the stories," he said. She traced her fingers over the cover. "I'd forgotten how it feels to be seen." He didn't respond, but when she opened the first page, she found a dried sprig of lavender pressed between the lines. And somewhere deep in her chest, a warmth returned. But peace does not come without testing. One morning, a lawyer came by, tall, hat-cold smile dust still on his coat. Said he'd been sent by her late father's estate. Claimed the land deed still had her name. Said she had every right to claim it. "But folks don't like complicated stories," he added, eyes scanning the porch. "And you living here, well, that complicates things." She stood still. The widower came to the door, and the man smelling opportunity pushed again. "You could own this place clean, sell it, start over, leave behind the whispers." She didn't flinch, just answered slow and sure. "I'd rather stay where the whispers don't win." He left, but not before muttering, "You'll regret it. Some roots rot slow." That night she said nothing, but she laid the lavender sprig on the table, and beside it a map of the ranch. "You think we could plant apple trees in the spring?" she asked. He looked at her long and quiet. "I think they'd do fine." Outside, snow still covered the ground, but something beneath had already begun to thaw. They didn't speak of love. Not yet. But the house was changing. Windows stayed open longer. Laughter, small, short, startled, returned. And one morning when a letter came addressed to the widow and her keeper, she laughed so hard she cried. He watched her quiet, then finally asked, "You ever wish you'd never come back?" She wiped her eyes, shook her head. "This place doesn't need me to be someone else. It just lets me be." And in that moment, the house, once starved of joy, took its first full breath in years. There were nights when the light in the kitchen burned longer than it should have. Nights when the snowstorm passed over. But something in the air still hadn't settled. Nights when she would sit in the old rocker by the fire needle, moving in steady rhythm, but her thoughts miles away, her face catching the lamplight, just so like it belonged to another time entirely. That night was one of those nights. He had come in late, smelling of frost and earth. The cattle had broken fence again. He didn't say a word as he pulled off his gloves, dropping them on the table with more weight than necessary. She looked up but didn't ask. She had learned that his silences had shapes, and this one was jagged. The stew on the stove had gone cold. She reheated it without speaking, ladled 2 bowls, set them down between them, like a peace offering. He nodded, took the spoon. Halfway through, he said it rough but low. "Ben Travis came by today." She stilled. Ben was a man who always wore his hat too low and his smile too loose. A neighbor who had once asked her within 2 months of her sister's funeral if she'd considered remarrying. "What did he want?" "Asked if I planned to keep you on. Said he had room on his spread if I didn't." Her face didn't change, but her hand curled around the spoon. He didn't look up. "Folks think I'm weak," he added after a moment, "for letting a woman handle my home. You didn't let me do anything." That earned her a glance, just a brief one, but it landed hard. "I know," he said. She rose, took his bowl, scraped the bottom with careful hands. Then, without turning, she asked the question that had been living in her ever since the lawyer's visit. "Do you want me gone?" He didn't answer. Not that night. And when the lamp finally went out, the silence stretched between their rooms like a sheet no wind could tear through. The next morning, she found an old saddle in the barn, one she hadn't seen before. Its leather was worn thin, but underneath the dust she could see her own initials burned into the underside. Her father's saddle. She hadn't known it was here. She brushed her hand across it slowly, that old sadness rising. She didn't ask how he'd found it or why he'd brought it out now. Instead, she carried it to the porch, left it in the sun to warm, then went back to the sewing room. Inside the house smelled of bread and rosemary, a smell she had learned to love, a smell that once only belonged to her sister's kitchen and now somehow was hers too. By the time he returned that evening, she had already made her choice, but she didn't say it, not yet. He walked in, coat damp from sleet. His eyes caught the saddle by the door. He paused, then looked to her. "You remember writing I never stopped?" He let out the smallest breath of a laugh. She took the loaf from the oven and cut it quietly, sliding a plate toward him. They ate together, slow, the lamp burning beside them, soft and low. When the dishes were cleared and the fire cracked low, she asked without looking up, "Did you ever love her?" Silence long, then, yes. Her fingers tightened on the table edge. She deserved better. He looked over finally, fully. "She had better in you." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Ripples of memory stirred in both of them. Tears not yet cried, truths not yet told. "I wasn't always kind," he added. "She wanted more than I knew how to give." And now he didn't answer, but she didn't expect him to, not that night. Instead, she rose, walked to the bookshelf, and pulled a leather-bound journal from the top, worn hand-stitched. She set it between them. She used to write things down, bits of days, recipes, dreams she never spoke aloud. He opened the cover with care. Inside, in delicate script, were 3 words written at the top of the first page. "Let them love each other." He blinked. She knew she whispered. He looked up, throat tight. She continued, maybe not with her eyes, not at the end, but her heart saw further. The lamp flickered. Rain tapped the windows, like someone knocking very softly from the outside. She stood, then walked to the fire, stared at the flames. "I don't want to replace her," she said. "I wouldn't let you," he said. Silence again, but not cold, not jagged. He rose, walked slowly to her side, stood without touching. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. I thought if I let go of her, I'd lose the last good thing I ever had. She turned, eyes shining. You didn't lose her, she said. She gave you what you needed to live, and now you're giving it back. He looked at her, and for once really saw her not as an echo of someone else, not as a shadow in the hall, but as the woman who had carried him back from the edge with quiet hands and unspoken hope. And that night when they sat again on the porch, she leaned her shoulder into his for the first time. He didn't pull away. They watched the sky together, storm clouds moving east, stars beginning to show. But it was what happened after that neither would ever forget. Just after midnight, a knock sharp, urgent. He opened the door to find the young bride from the neighboring ranch, cloak-soaked, eyes wide. It's my husband, she said. He's fallen bad. I didn't know who else. He didn't hesitate. Saddled the horse, grabbed his bag, rode off into the dark without a word. She stayed with the girl, boiled water, made broth, held her as she cried. The storm raged all night, and when the dawn came, so did he, mud-slick soaked, but alive. Broke a rib, he said. Said it best I could. The young wife clung to him in thanks and then turned to the woman who had waited and said, You saved us both. You're the kind of woman a house like this needs. After they left, he stood there in the quiet. She turned gently and asked, Still think they talk because we've done wrong? He shook his head slowly. I think they talk because they're afraid of what's true. What's that? That maybe healing doesn't look like what they expect. She stepped closer. And what does it look like to you? He took a long breath. It looks like a woman who stayed. The lamp on the porch burned that night until dawn. Neither of them slept, but neither of them felt alone again. The first wind of spring brought no blossoms, only a letter. It came folded in an envelope with sharp corners and a red wax seal too formal for their quiet life. The postman didn't look her in the eye when he handed it over. Just touched the brim of his hat and rode off quick as dust. She stood on the porch, hands unmoving, watching the paper breathe slightly in her fingers, as if it too feared what it held. He saw her from across the yard, wiping grease from his hands, and read the worry in her stillness before he saw the seal. She opened it inside, standing near the table, as if the old oak might steady her. Then she read it twice. When she finally looked up, her voice was low. My sister's kin, they're contesting the land. He didn't answer. They say I'm not rightful here, that her blood is gone, that nothing ties me. His hands curled into fists, slow and deliberate. They're wrong, but truth doesn't keep men from acting out of spite, and the dead once buried can't argue back. The letter was signed by a lawyer from Carson Ridge, distant cousin of her late sister, a man neither of them had ever met. He cited property law, inheritance codes, marriage claims. He threatened with grace, promised with venom. She folded the letter neatly, laid it on the mantel beside the dried lavender, and then she walked outside. For 3 days they didn't speak of it, not because they didn't care, but because naming a threat made it too real. Instead, she baked. He repaired the barn roof. She swept the porch twice a day. He hunted rabbit and returned with more than he needed. They circled the silence, keeping it at bay through ritual, through movement, through memory, until the fourth night when the church bell rang unexpected. Town hall was calling, a council, a reckoning. They rode in separate, not by intention, just habit. He arrived first, took a seat in the back, hat low, eyes steady. She entered minutes later, spine straight, as a fence post, hands folded in front of her like a teacher ready for war. The hall was full. Neighbors, old friends, former enemies, those who'd whispered and those who'd said nothing at all. The lawyer was already there, young, sharp, suited, with a voice that oiled its way through the room. He stood and smiled like a man selling shoes. My client does not wish to cause discomfort, but we must honor legacy. This land belonged to the deceased, and with her passing and the child's no direct heir remains. She remains, the widower said just that. He stood not tall, not loud, but unmoving, the way trees don't need to prove themselves. The room quieted. She came here not to claim, but to care. She made this place live again. The walls remember her voice now. The fields answer to her hands. That's more than inheritance. The lawyer frowned. Sentiment does not change law. Maybe not yours. He stepped forward, but I was a dead man walking, and she brought me back without asking anything in return. She earned this land more than I ever did. Someone in the crowd murmured agreement, then another. She didn't speak, not until they asked her, and when they did, her voice was not loud, but it held weight. I don't want the land. I don't want the deed. I just want to be allowed to stay in the place where I stop being invisible. Silence thick and golden. The vote wasn't formal. It didn't need to be. It happened in looks and nods, in the way even the lawyer stopped pushing once he realized he had no soil left to plant out in. When she left the hall, people parted, not like a woman to be pitied, but one to be honored. Outside under the wide spring sky, he waited beside her mule cart. She climbed up, sat beside him, didn't speak. He handed her a flask. She took a slow sip, then passed it back. I thought they'd take it from me, she said finally. I wouldn't have let them. She looked sideways. You alone couldn't have stopped them. No, he admitted, but love could. It was the first time either of them had said it. She didn't blink, just asked softly, Is that what this is? His fingers tightened on the reins, then loosened. It's not lightning, he said, not a fire. It's the slow thing, the kind that doesn't need proving. She nodded, looked out at the road. I could live with that. The mule walked slow through the dark hooves, gentle on packed earth, and the house, when they returned, had never looked more like home. That night she lit the porch lamp herself and left the door open behind her. Spring moved fast after that. Bud turned to bloom. She planted herbs where her sister's flower beds used to be. He built a second chair for the porch, one that rocked smoother than the first. Neighbors came by more, not to pry, just to sit, to share bread, to watch the sky. There was no wedding, no vows spoken under arches or pews, but the morning he carved her name into the barn beam, beside his late wife's, no one questioned it. He handed her the blade when he was done. Add what you want, he said. She didn't write a name, just a small heart beside the two. One evening, as dusk dipped gold across the fields, a rider approached, not a stranger, the young ranch wife from before this time, with a baby in her arms. She came, not in distress, but gratitude. They say you saved my marriage, she told him, just by staying when it was easier to run. They welcomed her inside, gave her stew, rocked the baby, while she cried softly in her cup. When she left, she whispered to the woman at the door, Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep lighting the lamp. The next storm rolled in late that month. Wind, fierce thunder, grumbling low. They didn't shutter the house, they let it rattle. Let the rain wash the windows, clean, sat together on the porch, wrapped in one quilt, his hand resting over hers. Neither spoke, they didn't need to. The candle on the sill burned steady, untouched by the wind. Long into the night, long after the storm passed, it would keep burning as long as they stayed, as long as they remembered, as long as love, quiet, earned, and unshakable, made a home where grief had once lived alone. And somewhere past where the prairie meets the stars, a woman long buried smiled softly in the dark, because she had given them both a beginning and they had built the rest. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.